welcome to the Innovation and Diffusion podcast. I'm Ruveyda Gozen, a research economist at the London School of Economics at the Program in Innovation and Diffusion.
And my name's John van Reenen. I'm a professor here at the LSE and I direct the Poyd Centre.
And today we're with a professor of economics at the London School of Economics, Xavier Jaravel. Welcome, Xavier. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me.
We're so happy to have you here.
Great to be here.
It's been a long way for Xavier to come, actually. He's had to walk down one flight of stairs in order to be in my office.
So I want to start by asking you some questions on, what makes you work on the fields that you're working on right now. So Xavier is very famous with his work on Einsteins and Marie Curies, inequality, innovation, and inflation. So I want to start by asking, what drives you to work on these topics?
Yeah, so I think what I'm excited about in these topics is that often in my work, there's something about economic growth and welfare and your longer run outcomes. So innovation is very much about that. Inflation is also sometimes about that. But the angle I take is also to relate that to inequality. So the idea is to find spaces where we can both increase growth and reduce inequality. What often economists think about equity efficiency trade-off as if you could only get one side of the equation. And so I think in many cases, actually, we can push both for more equality and more growth, better long-term outcomes. And some of this is actually the work that we did together with John on Lost Einsteins, Lost Marie Curies.
Should we tell the listeners a bit, how we started that? I think it's
That's great.
It's a bit of a funny story. I was visiting Harvard on a sabbatical. And I was in the office next to, invited by someone called Raz Chetty, who's very famous for doing a lot of work on inequality. And we got talking about, thinking about innovation, which he hadn't really worked on much before. And then he said, well, there's this kind of brilliant PhD student I know who's also interested. I've been talking to him. And then, he introduced me to Xavier and his team. And we started, I was just kind of completely blown away by how impressive he was and his ideas. And that's how the whole project got started.
Yeah, it was a fantastic paper and led to follow-on work. And in fact, with John, we were just discussing a moment ago before the interview that maybe we can do this again for the UK in the near future.
Oh, that's amazing. I think that would be great. By the way, did you have a role model? A role model or maybe a research paper that influenced you to choose this path?
I think I have several role models, and John would be one of them. Not to put him on the spot. Raj, who John just mentioned, would be someone also who was very influential for me. But I would say maybe a bit more broadly that what I found interesting early on in my PhD was that on the one hand there were lots of people working on macro, like people like Philippe Aguillon, who is now also at the LSE, and tackling these very, very big picture questions, but weren't using the micro data and the applied micro tools that I was seeing in labor economics, public economics. And so what I thought was interesting was to work at the intersection of these two worlds, the macro questions and the micro data and micro approaches. And innovation is one field where people have started doing this already, including John, but then I've tried to do that also in other fields like inflation.
I also want to ask you, how did you decide to be an economist? Why not something else but why did you choose to be an economist?
For me, it was driven by the desire to understand policy and maybe also contribute to policy in some ways. And so my undergraduate degree was basically I think in the UK people would call that PPE, philosophy, politics, economics. And then I did an exchange at Harvard, and there I took econ classes, and I thought it would be very cool to be specialized in one thing, to be able to develop a view on certain issues. And so this example of the Lost Einstein agenda is one thing, good example of that, or what we can learn about inflation. It takes us decades to work on these things, but then when inflation comes as a first order issue, then we have certain things to say. So that's what drove me to get. And I should also add that a lot of this also has to do with the US. So in the French system, I think I wouldn't have done a PhD because we're just not exposed as much to research careers, at least in some tracks. So the fact that I did this exchange in the US and then got to work with several professors, first as a research assistant, that played a major role. And again, that links to the Lost Einsteins agenda, where you need to expose people to careers for them to actually embrace them. And so in my case, it was very much true. I don't think I would have gone into economics as a researcher if I haven't spent some time in the US.
So we mentioned a few times this Lost Einstein or Lost Marie Curie idea. maybe you should talk a bit, Xavier, about what it is and what it means.
Yeah, so basically in work with John Raschetti and other co-authors, we figured out that there was basically a large pool of untapped talent for innovation. So people who would have the abilities, the drive to become entrepreneurs, scientists, inventors, but who just didn't do it. And we first documented this with simple stylized facts, showing that the probability that you become an inventor really depends on your socioeconomic background, where you grow up. So the fact that there is this relationship is maybe not too surprising, but what's surprising to us was the magnitude. So one number is, if you take people in the US whose parents are in the top 1% of the income distribution, they're about 10 times more likely to become a patent inventor than people below the median of the income distribution. And interestingly, we found that this is still largely true if you focus on people who make it to the top universities. So even at MIT, you're more likely to become a patent inventor if you are from a certain more affluent background. It's not just that, it's also where you grew up, whether your parents or relatives of your parents are inventors themselves. And so in follow-on analysis, we showed that this is really something that depends on what we call exposure to this type of careers, rather than just the fact that you did a STEM degree. So there's like all the different levels at which you can lose this untapped potential. People who don't go into STEM, in particular women, and then even after getting one of these degrees, you may not consider entrepreneurship or innovation as a career. And then since this sort of first study that we did with John, there was more work. So one, for example, in France has tested more concrete steps that can be taken to indeed expose people to this kind of career, STEM, innovation careers. And they found that this works. So there's like RCTs, so experimental evidence, that you can increase by 50% the share of female high school students who go to STEM fields, to some of the most selective STEM fields, which are good predictors of them going into these fields of innovation. And another line of work is more macro, so it's other work that I've done more recently, where you can take some of the numbers we had from the earlier work and then assess how big of a deal it could be for macroeconomic growth. So using standard macro models, but applied to these questions of allocation of talent. And you find very large numbers. It could be like, if we could mobilize everyone, we could perhaps double the growth rate, so going from 1% to 2% TFP growth, because it's such a large mass of untapped talent. And so all of this, you can see that it relates to different areas of economics, RCTs, careful studies of administrative data sets to get the status facts, but also more macroeconomic approaches.
One of the kind of important lessons from the work is that it pushes back against the common view of inventors, that they're kind of born, that you're just born
exactly
as a brilliant inventor, and there's nothing you can do to change it. It's just in your genes. I think what this work shows is that inventors are made, not just born. I mean, yes, you need to have some intrinsic talent, but it's more important what you're exposed to, what the environment is that you grow up, and who your teachers were. Those things actually mean that a lot more people could be inventors than currently are.
So can we say, for instance, in terms of the policy implications, would that suggest that we should have a more inclusive education policy to uncover those lost Einsteins or Marie Curies? What would be the policy implications of that paper, or from your findings from other research as well?
Yeah, maybe think two things. The first point is in terms of innovation strategy, basically saying that finding these lost Einsteins and lost Marie Curies is something very important. That should be a real pillar of innovation policy. And so that already is very new, because I think still to this day, no one takes this really seriously. So, the innovation policy is more about industrial policy. Today, there's lots of debates about specific sectors, AI, semiconductors, and that can all be very important. But in the end, you need people to work in those fields. And so I think first, viewing this as a priority, finding the lost Einsteins, lost Marie Curies, is already very important. And I think we have the evidence we need to scientifically say that this matters. And then point number two is, what can you do in practice? And today I think there's several things that are plausible. Mentorship programs, discovering the work of inventors through internships. Mentorship can be sustained in time, but it can also be just someone going to a school and describing their career. So this RCT that was done in France that I alluded to earlier was just a 2-hour intervention in French high schools, and then that had a big impact on the choice of STEM fields. There's lots of interventions that are plausible, and so I think the goal now is to find the ones that work best and then to bring it to scale. So I think where we are now is different people have started testing different things, but we're not at the point where at least most governments, if any, really take this and put it at a large scale. So I think to your question about inclusivity of the education system, one aspect of this is discovering careers, in particular scientific careers. And then, of course, there's a much broader agenda, which is to increase the quality of education more broadly. And this is not just about becoming an inventor, and that matters also for diffusion of innovations. But specifically on the Lost Einstein, it's more about discovering these careers and having role models that you can identify with. Maybe one thing I can say quickly on that is the RCT in France. Randomized controlled trials. It's an experiment. So they randomized who is going to get a presentation on scientific careers and who is not going to get that. So in a sample of a large number of French high schools, and so we had 100,000 students involved in this. And they found that this had a big impact on the choice of young girls in choosing to go to selective STEM programs in higher education. But this worked only when it was actually a woman presenting the work and the career. So again, you might find this intuitive, but the size of the difference, you go from something that has basically no effect when it's a man presenting to a large effect where you increase by 50% the share of young students going to these STEM fields is a very large effect. And it's very different from sometimes what you hear that you just need to provide information. Here's more like you need to provide a role model and someone who embodies this career, someone you can identify with.
I completely agree. And maybe the first question that I asked you, do you have a role model? I think that's an important question, for other people to figure out, who their role model is, and then what they do with their career, based on that, for example. I want to switch to a little bit towards the creative destruction and the inequality perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a debate actually. So whether creative destruction causes inequality, persistent inequality, we're going to define those, what they mean. But does creative destruction cause inequality?
I think my answer would be that we can shape creative destruction to get both more growth and less inequality if we do it the right way. And then we can look historically at what has happened. And I think for the most part, creative destruction hasn't been a force that has dramatically increased inequality, but this is somewhat nuanced. It depends a bit on the period, on the countries. And so there are many ramifications there. I think in your question, there's also implicitly the question of what do we mean by inequality? So for example, we can mean what's the share of income of the top 1%? And so for some countries like the United States, we have good data about the people who are in the top 1%. And so some people have shown that entrepreneurs are overrepresented in this group. And so that suggests that there's a big role for entrepreneurship and different forms of innovation at the top of the income distribution. So the typical person in the top 0.1% of the income distribution in the US is someone who has a firm with about 100 people, and you could call them entrepreneurs. They're not necessarily creating the next Google, but they are engaged in some form of entrepreneurship and innovation. So that's one first reason why people might think innovation goes hand in hand with inequality. Another reason is we think about the giant firms, Google, Apple, Amazon, others. And you have these returns to scale, where once you are an established search engine, it's very hard to be superseded by anyone else. And so you have a lot of power, perhaps more power than some states. And so some people would say, well, there's something can be democratically dangerous about letting the technologies be in the hand of a small number of companies. But by logic of returns to scale, it's sort of what happens. That's the two first forms of inequality. And the third one is sort of what you alluded to as well in your question about intergenerational mobility. So is it the case that people from more affluent backgrounds end up being the entrepreneurs of tomorrow? Or is it the case, in fact, that if you're from a low-income background, you can still have access to entrepreneurship, and that could be a way to have a much better life trajectories than, say, your parents. And so I think in the data, there's lots of papers in all of these topics, maybe emphasizing two key themes. First one is temporary versus persistent inequality. So if creative destruction works well, as the name suggests, we're destroying something. So we're destroying the rents of established players. So one example could be OpenAI. With ChatGPT, they actually ended up challenging Google. That's one example of an innovation. Maybe Google will reply now with their own large language model, and maybe they will end up doing better. But that's one example where a very dominant player has actually been challenged by a very small player.
By the way, did you start using ChatGPT for your papers, like to
not
so
not so far, but I hear that for coding is very good. So that's on my list.
Yeah, no, we found. We've started to use it a bit. So one of my pre-docs, who actually is in the room next door, has been using it for coding. It's very useful for coding and for like literature reviews. It can be quite. Except ChatGPT makes up a few references, hallucinations as they're called.
That's right.
You have to be very careful.
Yeah. So that's one example. Maybe to continue on the ChatGPT theme, some people ran RCTs, experiments, with ChatGPT and in different contexts, like for example, data collection task or data analysis. And so far, everyone has found that this increases productivity across the board, but more so actually for the less productive individuals, because they can sort of speed up tasks that they wouldn't have been so good at. So that's one example where it's perhaps not a technology that will increase inequality, because it's a technology that maybe makes the less productive at baseline more productive. And also it's a technology that goes after a more cognitive, analytical type of tasks. And so that's very different from the automation of the past, where we were more like automating routine tasks with low cognitive content, less analytical content, and that was more for the middle class or the lower income groups. Those were the groups targeted by technology. So that's one other example where this new wave of technology actually might be reducing inequality, because it goes after the skilled professions, and it might, if anything, expand more the opportunities perhaps of the lower income group. So it's hard to say, but I think there is some hope there. And so just maybe to go back briefly to the persistent versus transitory inequality, the argument there was that you have to have a longer view and see if the innovators of tomorrow can still displace the innovators of today. And if you can orchestrate that, then you can have both more growth, more innovation, and inequalities that are perhaps more tolerable because they are less sustained.
I think that's really important, just to emphasize that, because in a way I think a bit like meritocracy. So if we think about why a lot of people hate inequality, it's because it means that the rich of today can pass on the benefits to their children. And I think that's a much more insidious form of inequality, because it kind of means that people who start off with advantages, even if they're less talented, can get ahead of people who are more talented because their parents aren't wealthy or aren't powerful or aren't rich. And similarly in business, the way you described it, Xavier, that is, if a business gets to be successful, but once it gets to through innovation or through competing with the merits, once it gets there, it starts putting up barriers so that new entrants or new firms just can't compete. It kind of kills them off or buys them up. Then I think it becomes a real problem, because then those incumbent dominant firms are reducing the chance of rivals to come in, and also reducing their innovation potentially, which leads to a slower growing, less good society. So I think that both of those are really, that meritocratic idea in business and amongst individuals is really important.
Yeah, and I think what that means is that ultimately it really depends on the institutional setup and the policies we put in place. So competition policy is key to avoid that you have this rents from innovation that in fact become persistent, and the barriers that John was describing, that the barriers would be created by the dominant firms. And education, exposure to this type of career is also another angle to make sure that you don't have a small elite that enjoys the benefit of innovation from generation to generation. So I think from the work we've done, we have some concrete ideas of what to do for that part. Education, who becomes an inventor, and that's really key in thinking about this notion of intergenerational inequality. And then much more can and should also be done on the competition policy front, and there's lots of that about regulating digital markets, for example, is one big area where this is being discussed today.
So, and I think political connections also play an important role here, right? You have a chapter in John's book as well.
John's book.
Of course, yeah. So there, for instance, I was looking at it, and then you talk about like lobbying, for instance. Like, do you think this competition policy policy would be able to kind of reduce the power of those firms and political connections and lead to a better, outcome?
Yes, I think that's for me a bit hard to answer in the abstract. I think what the authors of the work that we describe in this chapter, they show that you have a lot of political connections, and so it can be a real risk in different contexts. And then I think you have to think about each sector, in its own way. So, for example, with digital markets, one thing is the political connections, which you want to prevent. You don't want money in politics. You don't want firms to be able to campaign reform, campaign financing. This is all key. And then you have another series of reforms that are more sector specific, how you make sure that players don't stay established for too long.
So let's switch gears towards inflation inequality. So we talked about creative destruction, whether it may cause inequality. So I know there's a really high inflation in Turkey, so I'm very much interested in that. And I think everyone is experiencing it really badly in Turkey right now. So what is inflation inequality? Can you define that for us? And what is the relationship between inflation inequality and innovation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I started working on that much before the current surge in inflation. So I found some evidence for inflation inequality prior to 2020. So let me tell you what it means and where that came from. Then we can talk about the more recent period as well. So inflation inequality means that people experience a different change in their cost of living. And that is just because they buy different things. So say I buy organic food and say organic food benefits from lots of productivity improvements because more and more farmers adopt the latest technologies, and then now they have these organic certifications, and they drive down prices, they drive up quality, they intensify competition in this market segment. So then I would enjoy higher quality, lower prices for these organic food products. And so that, for me, means that cost of living is not increasing too much for food. Maybe it's even decreasing. But then maybe a lower income group doesn't buy these products. And for them, they don't have these innovations in organic food, and for them the inflation rate for food is much higher. And in fact, that's exactly what we see in the United States. So I take this example of food because it makes things concrete, and it also has clear and direct policy implications, because in the US, one of the main programs to alleviate poverty is called food stamps, which are vouchers to buy food, but they're indexed on the average food inflation. So meaning that we increase the amount we give to people based on the average change in prices in the food category. So when the rich buy organic products with low inflation, that drives down inflation for the entire food category. And then that's what we use actually. We use the total number to adjust the amount we give to the low-income groups for their vouchers. And so in fact, we don't give them enough so that they could keep buying products that they buy. And so if you look at the data over about 10 years, that erodes the actual value of food stamps by about 20%. So that means that if you just want to keep the value at what it really was 10 years ago, you should increase the amount of given in food stamp by 20%. And so that example sort of shows, I think, already the link between innovation and inflation inequality. What drove this was that the rich in the US were getting richer. And so that led firms, inventors to invest more in those growing markets, fighting to get market shares in those growing markets for organic food. And so then that drove down prices, adjusted for quality. And it turns out this logic is much broader. So in some of my work, in some colleagues' work as well, we see one, that inflation has been lower for the rich in the US for decades. So if you even go back to the 1950s, over the very long run, you have low inflation rates for the rich. So if you're poor, you kind of lose. If you're poor and you stay poor, you lose twice, because you stay poor, but also you face cost of living that increases faster. And this is about productivity dynamics between sectors, because these productivity dynamics are largely endogenous to market size. So when a country gets richer overall, and also when the rich get richer faster, that all means that the more luxury products get more demand. They get a faster increase in demand because everyone gets richer, and in particular the rich get richer even faster. And so we see these long-run trends of faster innovation in the categories and for specific goods that cater more to the rich. So you could have thought innovation is just random or exogenous, but in fact, no, we see it's endogenous to market size. So if you change market size, you change your direction of innovation. And then ultimately that matters for inflation and for the actual level of purchasing power inequality.
So luxury yachts and private jets are getting better.
Exactly. And organic food. Yeah.
Bananas or nuts or things like that.
And even all the general purpose technologies, so the internet, ChatGPT, they always need to be then incorporated in the production process. But you have stronger incentives to do this when eventually you sell to the rich. So the yacht, for example, could use maybe a lot of internet gadgets, electronics, and maybe tomorrow ChatGPT as well, to increase quality of service for this type of customers.
So I want to now talk a bit about the cheesy questions
Okay.
that I prepare for you. I want to ask you first, what are the most important qualifications for a researcher in your opinion? So for instance, if you wanted to hire someone, what are the qualities or what are the qualifications that you look at to hire that person?
I think one thing that I would highlight that maybe we don't tend to highlight very often is the ability to ask a novel and conceptually interesting question. So the way we train our PhD students it's a lot about technical skills, structural models, estimation of causal effects. We also insist on entrepreneurial drive. Can they get great data? And all of this matters a lot, but I think ultimately it all comes down to what you're doing with this. Is this in the service of an interesting question? Is it a conceptually new angle on something that people hadn't even raised before? And so there aren't that many papers in economics that are conceptually novel, but there are still quite a few, enough. And so I think we all know examples of this. And so I think as a PhD student on the job market, highlighting the extent to which what you do is conceptually novel is very important.
I mean, in a way, that's innovation.
It is innovation.
Often what people were looking for, which makes somebody stand out, is exactly that they're trying to do something different, really different than what's been done before, not just tweak a parameter or apply an old methodology to a new question, but actually something really that's hard to do, but it really stands out, I think. I sort of throw in something here, just so people may not know this about Xavier, which is that not only is he a brilliant economist, he's won the prize for the best French economist under the age of 40. Is that right? Yeah. So. But also, he is very involved with policy. He actually spent a year working in France in a policy making capacity in the kind of equivalent of the Council of Economic Advisors. Is that
at the French Finance Ministry, and we sort of created a new unit there. There used to be no PhD economists, and now they hire there on a regular basis.
So I think, it's often. It relates to people thinking about their careers. Often people think, well, the only, if I want to be a great researcher, the only thing I should do is research and nothing else. And I think actually, if you look at many economists, including Xavier, you can be a amazingly top-rated economist, but also spend time working in a policy environment. And that actually often gives you ideas for new papers. And I think these are often quite complementary things to do together. But I think it's worth pointing that out, because I think it is one of the things I admire about Xavier, actually getting his hands dirty.
Thank you.
Policy.
I think it's also super interesting. And it's a way to put into practice some of the things we learn.
I'll ask you a few more things, but I think, I asked this question to some of our guests, and I want to ask that to you as well. So is there something, what do you love about academia? Because we talked about your policy aspect as well, but what do you love about academia? And is there something that you hate about academia or you don't like? Let me not say hate, maybe, but dislike.
I think we're very lucky in the variety of the work we do, the freedom we have, so we can pick any research paper. We have a variety of things. So in a single day, we can go teaching. We work on new papers, work on old papers. We work on sort of raising awareness of prior work, like we're doing now with this podcast. And so that's what I like most, the fact that it's a way to be involved in many different things and sort of chart your own course. And at the same time, it remains a well-defined field. So we have methods that everyone uses. So we can be creative, but in a framework that is widely accepted. And so then that's a good way to communicate with a large number of colleagues and also get feedback, because the field is very well organized and all use the same methods. And maybe what I like least is the time frame. So if you take the example of the paper with John, so it started in 2012. It came out in the QJA, which is a great outcome, in 2019. And it's 7 years. And it's not even I have another paper that just came out a month ago, and it was accepted a month ago, but it started 8 years ago. So it will come out even later. And so I think it's easy to be impatient, and It's also easy to start then too many projects and to too many things at once. And so I think the long time frame and also the fact that then it's tempting to do too many things, those are some of the challenges.
So since you also, started talking about the papers and, that you published, maybe we can talk about your current or recent projects and what are you working on? And also I want to ask, what are the research questions that you think we need more answer to?
So let me give you an example that illustrates what I said at the beginning about being inspired by macro questions, but then micro data. So one paper that we just put online 2 weeks ago is getting after an old age macro question, which is, what do people do when you give them money for stimulus? So, like during a downturn, usually you would give them money. It could be a tax refund. It could be something else. And so to what extent will people save that or actually spend it? Like some people sometimes call this helicopter money. Like we throw a lot of money at the population in different ways, say tax refunds. Do they actually spend it? Do they actually save it? And the answer to that then is very important to know how big of a stimulus package you want to do. Will the stimulus package work or not? And in fact, to this day, this question remains unanswered or not very well answered because it's very hard to have a clean control group, people who are comparable to those who get the money. So what we actually did is we raised 300,000 euros and we did an actual experiment. So we did an RCT. We did this in France. We have a partner, which is a bank, and we have access to the bank accounts. So we can see all their consumption, what they buy, and then we actually at random gave money to a group, and we have also different kinds of things. So we have a normal transfer, you just get the money, and another type, you get a card that expires after 3 weeks. And so the standard economist answer would be that it doesn't matter if you give it with a card that expires or not, because people should see money as fungible. Give them money on this card, but they will use it to do the groceries, and you could just have had the money in their account. That doesn't change anything. And in fact, we find something completely different. So first, we are able finally to get the numbers for how much people save when it's a normal transfer. And the answer is that they actually save 80% of it, which is larger than I think what most macroeconomists think and the way they basically set up their models. But they don't save everything, right? But they save 80%. On the other hand, if you give the card with a 3-week expiry date, they behave completely differently. And they, in fact, save much less. They save only 40% and spend 60% of it. And so and then there's many other things that go on in this paper, but that's one example of a paper that for me I found very interesting to work on, because we took a very old question and went at it with microdata. It was lots of logistical hurdles to get the money and get the experiment to work with the data partner, but eventually it all worked. And then we think that that there's lots of follow-on things to do with this. For example, do we want central banks to have something like an account at the central bank where I could give you money and it expires in 3 weeks? So it opens up all these other questions. And so I think this is the kind of thing that would require more work. But more broadly, these micro questions with micro data, I think, are a promising broad area going forward.
What was the biggest challenge that you encountered with, and how did you solve it?
I think at every step we thought the project would fail. So when we trying to raise the money, we thought no one will give us 300,000 euros. They did. Then we think with the partner.
Can you say who gave you?
Yeah. So it's a French agency. It's the Agence Nationale de la Recherche, so the National Agency for Research in France. We were quite surprised that it worked out. The central banks didn't want to fund it because they thought it was too politically charged. But eventually it worked. So step number one. And then just the implementation. So getting because you have to work with lots of different people. You have to convince a bank to do this. So eventually, again, it worked, but probably with a fair bit of luck involved. So I think what we did to overcome the challenge is just to be stubborn and keep trying and maybe not think too much about all the difficulties that were lying ahead. Otherwise, probably we wouldn't have started.
I was going to say, it's a bit like being an entrepreneur, really, isn't it? I mean, people, this is not entirely true, but the idea of people have the idea of an entrepreneur is that they're kind of, they love taking risks. And if they knew they knew that the failure rate was so high for being an entrepreneur, people wouldn't become entrepreneurs in the first place. So being a researcher was a bit like being an entrepreneur. If we thought about all the problems we were going to face, when I met Xavier and described this project to him, if he knew it was going to take 7 years,
It was very smooth, I think, overall. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Xavier. It was great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was a great conversation, and I hope our listeners also enjoyed the talk. So if you have any questions or comments, please email us at lsepodcast@gmail.com or tweet us at Poid_cast. We're looking forward to your comments and suggestions. Have a good day, everybody. See you in the next episode.
Thank you. Bye.